We're now joined by Sami Hamdi, who's the editor-in-chief of International Interest, a United Kingdom-based international magazine. Sami, good evening. Thanks very much for joining us. Always good to talk to you.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
So, opening this road, inverted commas, was that supposed to send a message? And if so, it doesn't look like it's worked.
Part of the outcomes of the Libyan National Dialogue, or Libyan Political Forum, which we call it the National Dialogue for ease of understanding, part of the outcomes was an agreement by which there would be a merger of the institutions of Eastern Libya and Western Libya that had been de facto divided as a result of the competing factions. And part of merging those institutions meant reopening the connection of the ports between them, whether that's the airports or whether that's the roads. And this particular road is of vital importance in that it's a very important road that connects west to east. It's also important to put this refusal by the forces in the east to open the road within its context, which is that the government of national unity, which is the government that emerged from the national dialogue, has been trying to assert its authority over all of Libya, not just Western Libya, where it is based. And Haftar has dug his heels in and refused to allow this government to assert itself. A few months ago, the prime minister of the government of national unity, which is the government that emerged from the national dialogue, he wanted to land in Benghazi and to visit the city of Benghazi, which is the capital which is the capital of the east, where Haftar is based. Haftar refused to allow the prime minister to attend and refused to allow his security consort or the security escort to land in Benghazi. And the statement that was made was essentially that the prime minister could come as a citizen, but not as a prime minister of Libya. And the fact that the prime minister could not find any international leverage or support to force Haftar to allow him to land in Benghazi suggested the lack of international appetite to really exert the resources to enforce this national government on all of Libya, as opposed to just on Western Libya. So it's in this context that the reopening of the road comes, in the sense that this government now is trying to embarrass Haftar internationally, provoke the international community to get involved, to force Haftar to abide by the outcomes of the national dialogue. The prime minister even got into a car and went towards, as you described it in your introduction, went towards the areas where the forces in the east are blocking the road, and he had to turn back, suggesting that despite the provocation, the international community didn't move, and the prime minister of the government of national unity, Debeba, did not find that international backing and did not see an international response to force Haftar to open the road. And I think what we saw today bodes ill for the future of the idea of elections or the future of Libya, especially given that it coincides with Haftar's forces entering the south under the pretext of fighting terrorism.
Didn't Haftar agree to these interim arrangements? So why is he taking such a hard line here?
Haftar nominally agreed. He wasn't actually part of the national dialogue. There was this sense that they should no longer give him an official position, and he was rather represented by allies and represented by Aguila Saleh, who is the head of the House of Representatives. Officially, Haftar has no position and he has no role to play in the national dialogue, but he remains a presence, the elephant in the room that simply cannot be ignored. So while you have the international community trying to engage with official institutions, i.e. the government of national unity and the House of Representatives that is based in the east, the reality is that everybody is finding that Haftar is not going away and that he holds the de facto power in the east. So even if you're trying to sideline him in order to emphasize the authority of the official institutions, the reality is that the ambassadors find that they always end up having to go to visit Haftar and giving him this legitimacy that everybody in the official institutions is trying to deny him so that they can emphasize their own authority and their own power. In other words, it appears that Haftar continues to be relevant despite the fact that he has no official position. So in many ways, that sends a clear message to Haftar, which is that you're still relevant. We will still deal with you. We still recognize you, even though that we've sidelined you officially. And I think Haftar takes great confidence in this. And Haftar believes that the reason they are doing that is because the alternative is to deploy force and resources to force Haftar to abide by the outcomes. So if that is not happening, if they are not expending those resources to force Haftar to abide. That means that they are not willing to expend those resources, and they're willing to adapt to a status quo where Haftar continues to be irrelevant. Ergo, Haftar says, I don't need to respect the outcomes. I don't need to abide by what the national dialogue agreed, and the international community will still deal with me. They will still make me relevant, and I will still be able to call the shots in the East. And the dark reality is this: Haftar is right. Biden is not interested in Libya. It's not his priority. The Europeans don't care what happens in Libya, even if it splits between East and West. The Europeans just want an end to the migrant crisis and an end to the security issue, or what they describe as a terrorism. If that means dividing Libya between Haftar and the West, they have no problem doing so. The Turks are interested in establishing their military bases in the West and their maritime interest through the port in Misrata. The Russians are celebrating. They've established their military bases. They're firmly entrenched through the Wagner mercenary groups in eastern Libya. The UAE is happy in that the Islamists are no longer in control. Egypt just wants security on its border. In other words, when you look at the individual interests of the international powers, disciplining Haftar is not a priority. And they can live with a Libya in which Haftar continues to offend the sensibilities of those who supported the national dialogue. And that's the problem that the government of national unity has. The prime minister of the government of national unity has been trying to provoke the international community to uphold the outcomes, but he's increasingly finding that there is no real interest in the government of national unity, and that its value is not in its ability, or its value is not in the fact that it's a government, but its value is in that Biden can say to the world, America is back, we established the government, and it doesn't look beyond that as to what that actually means on the ground. In other words, it's very similar to Iraq, where they have elections, they have a government, but it's impotent and Iraq is in chaos. But on official paper, it looks fine. That's the outcome, it appears, that the international powers are going towards in Libya, and that's why Haftar believes that it's no problem, I'll reject them and nobody's going to do anything about it.
So then what are they going to be discussing in Berlin that will have any consequence? And then what will be the point of these elections if this key player, Haftar, becomes even more emboldened?
I think it's important to stress that the conference that's taking place in Berlin is very similar to the conference that took place, the first Berlin conference. The first Berlin conference came out with a series of outcomes that were not implemented and not taken seriously. And while many tried to attribute credit to the first Berlin conference in terms of laying the groundwork for national dialogue between the Libyan parties, the reality is that it was military intervention of Turkey and then the threat of Egypt and Russia to counter the Turkish intervention that forced this military equilibrium that brought about the national dialogue. It had nothing to do with Berlin, even if Berlin perhaps meant that there was a head start in terms of what framework might be applied in terms of the talks. Berlin, too, is more about the international powers coming together and trying to iron out some sort of framework within which to respect each other's interests in Libya. So, for example, the French are concerned over the presence of foreign fighters and, more importantly, Turkish influence that is expanding in Francophone countries and threatening French influence. The Europeans are concerned by the Russians. Biden wants to see some sort of solution and wants to see elections take place in order to have some sort of success in his administration after he's found that foreign policy is harder to deal with when you're actually president as opposed to merely a presidential candidate. So it's becoming abundantly clear that what's happening in Berlin too is the international powers are coming together and saying, look, this is the reality of the situation. We have East and West, we have the Russians, we have the Turks, and everybody's sort of saying, listen, this is what I want. What can you give me? Let's come to some sort of framework and arrangement whereby we can all take advantage of Libya together. And this is the dark reality, in that the emphasis is on the international accord, not on Libyan accord. The emphasis is that the international powers will agree between themselves, and the expectation is that these international powers will then go back to their proxies in Libya and say, this is what we agreed, go and implement it. The Russians and the Emiratis and the French will go to Haftar and say to Haftar, this is what we agreed, go and implement it. The Turks will go to Misrata and to the other factions and say, this is what we agreed, go and implement it. Biden will say, I don't want a war, make sure you go to elections, even if that means you divide up the cake between yourselves, just make sure you go to elections so that it all looks good. And Europe essentially says to the Turks and to the Russians, we don't like the idea of foreign mercenaries, try to find some sort of official way into which to get your forces to be present in Libya so that we can tackle this terrorism and migrant crisis that we have. That's what Berlin is all about. It's nothing to do about Libya in terms of its stability or prosperity, but rather about how Libya fits in the framework of the international community, now that it has been divided up by the international powers, and now that the Libyans have no inclination to reconcile between themselves, and given that for the international community, it appears that the conclusion is, if the Libyans can't live together, just split between East and West and be done with it.
But Khalifa Haftar also has to calculate the risk, because by keeping this coastal road closed, that means economic activity is restricted in a country where people need for the economy to kick off, to create jobs and recover from years of civil war. And so the people on the ground perhaps may lose patience with Haftar.
In theory, what you say is correct. In de facto terms, it doesn't have much relevance, primarily because what Haftar managed to secure, what he managed to pull off in spectacular fashion, was an agreement with the government in Tripoli in which they would take over the debt that he has incurred in the east, and that they would take over the debt that the House of Representatives has incurred in the east. So those billions that he spent in order to shore up his own forces, now it's the government of national unity that is now taking up the bill as part of this process of unifying the institutions. And this is what was very awkward about the national dialogue, in that everybody knew that it was a get out of jail free card for Haftar, but still the international community went ahead with it. And when people believed that the exchange would be that Haftar would be tamed and that Haftar would no longer be in that position, they found that while the government of national unity took on that financial burden, nothing was being done to curtail Haftar. And the reality is now the expenses that Haftar is taking in terms of spending on government institutions and the like, that burden is now being taken by the government of national accord with no impact to what Haftar is actually doing. The second thing to be aware of is that Haftar is receiving investment via the UAE and via his other supporters. It may not necessarily bring about that economic prosperity, but it will certainly temper the economic impact that might perhaps lead people to turn against Haftar. And the third, or at least rebel against Haftar. And the third important dynamic is this: Haftar rules by force, kidnapping activists, kidnapping journalists, assassinations, getting rid of people who threaten him. This is a man who rules by force, just as the other factions in the rest of Libya are also ruling by force. In other words, it's not easy to rise up against Haftar, especially given that he has a patronage model whereby he coaxes the other tribes around him to support his cause. And it's noteworthy that he has enough power that he can now repeat this process like he did in 2014 and 2015 in sending his forces in the south under the pretext of fighting terrorism, which, if you open a map and you look at where Fazan is, means that he's now starting to once more create this sort of front line with which he can later launch another attack on Tripoli. And if the Russians are willing to support him, there's nothing, of course, to prevent the country falling back into war. And I think the Turks are concerned about this. And a high-level military delegation visited Tripoli 4 or 5 days ago, unexpectedly, in what was a very ominous visit that made everybody suddenly sit up and say, wait a minute, are we now going closer on the verge of war? And so I think it's important to stress that while your point about the economic issue is relevant, while it's correct in theory, the reality is that Haftar rules by force, and Libya is still in this case of a civil war between the East and West, and that any uprising against Haftar receives enough funding to keep the necessary allies at ease and necessary allies on his side. So there is no room for this prospect of revolt against Haftar.
Sami, Hamdi, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Your insights always greatly appreciated. Many thanks to you.